I'm Lauren Borchardt, Director of Historic Programs here at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We're so delighted that you've joined us again today for Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane, speaking about one of the intersections on Capitol Hill, its past, how it's changed, and some stories perhaps even about its present. To get started with today's talk, I'll turn it over now to Jane Campbell, the President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really think we all owe Lauren a great debt. She has stepped up to the plate and learned how to do virtual webinars in just a hot minute as we all went into lockdown. And the Historical Society has for 50 years been telling the story of the United States Capitol as the temple of democracy, talking about the work of the people who go to work in the Capitol every day, and what the Capitol means as a symbol of our freedom, not only for every American, but indeed across the world. And we are very fortunate to have with us our most distinguished Chief Tour Guide and Director of Public Programs, Steve Livengood. Steve has been doing tours of the United States Capitol for 50 years. And this is a continuing series about the grounds of the Capitol. And how did we create this grounds? What does it mean? What did it look like one day? And what does it look like today? So we will take you on a virtual tour. And today we will go to one intersection. Next week we'll go to another intersection. So each week we go to a different intersection and look at the Capitol from a new perspective. We also, while we have your attention, want to make sure to invite you to the rest of our series. What we've been doing, now that we've learned how to work the virtual webinar, the very first question, the very first seminar that we did with Steve, he talked about the Statue of Freedom and how important it was that the Statue of Freedom was really put together with leadership by Philip Reed, who was an enslaved person when he began that process and was granted his freedom before the Statue of Freedom was finally raised. And that raised a bunch of questions from our audience that said, can you tell us more about what really went on with the African Americans and the role in building the Capitol? And we will invite you next Wednesday to our Scholar Series to meet Felicia Bell, who is an expert on African Americans and the Capitol. And if you look on our website, you can see the information about her work. It's called From Freedom's Shadow, and Felicia was one of the original creator of that exhibit. So we're very honored to have her join us next week, Wednesday. And tomorrow, if you want to take a tour of the inside of the Capitol, the Capitol Visitor Center has created a video, and they are going to have their premiere launch in this very space tomorrow at noon. So all of these are available on our website, USCHS.org. Please sign up and join us. We'd be honored to have you at each and every of these events. And so enough about the commercials, but I just want you to know the opportunities that are there. It is now my honor and my privilege to present to you my colleague, distinguished historian and knowledge of the Capitol, Steve Livengood. Take us for a walk.
Hi, this is Steve. We're going to go around the neighborhood of the Capitol now over the next few sessions. Anyway, we're going to talk today about information, particularly from our book. The cover is displayed here, Creating Capitol Hill. And we're going to talk about the intersections around the Capitol, and today starting with Second and Constitution. This is the intersection we're going to be talking about. You can see the Capitol itself there on the left. This is L'Enfant's map. The Capitol didn't ever actually look like that, but the intersection we're going to talk about is the one that has the orange arrow. And the reason I chose it, this is a different map, Ken Bowling's map from, Don Hawkins' map of 1801 on Capitol Hill, and from the book Creating Capitol Hill. And the building we're going to start with is the one that has this arrow here. You can see the Capitol is there just to the left of center, and you've got a rectangle darkened on the top, and an equal rectangle open on the bottom, and that's because the top part had been built yet. That's the Senate had been built. That's the Senate. The one on the bottom, the foundations were there, but they had not built that section yet. But you can see a little bit of the Capitol grounds there, and then this angled street that goes out there is Maryland Avenue, which came right into the Capitol grounds. And this is the house that was built immediately by Robert Sewell. And the reason I picked it is that this is the one remaining building from that era besides the Capitol itself. On the left, here's a picture of the house as it appears now. And on the right is a picture of it taken in 1863 from the Capitol Dome. So you can see it looks considerably different now, and there's good reasons for that. We'll talk about the history of it. Robert Sewell was a relative by marriage of Daniel Carroll, and last week we talked about Daniel Carroll and his role in owning and developing the property here around the Capitol building. And he had gotten his relative, who was quite wealthy, to build a house here, not for himself, but to rent out. They wanted nice properties up here, so that particularly so that the cabinet officers that moved to Washington to start the government here would live around the Capitol building. They would be working around the White House, but they wanted to help develop this neighborhood. And so he got his relative to build this nice house here for speculation. And then he got another relative to talk to the Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to convince him to live in the house. And here's Albert Gallatin. He was Secretary of the Treasury for 12 years, 1801 to 1813. And during that time, he lived in this house. And this is important because Albert Gallatin was born and raised in Geneva in Switzerland, and came to America as an adult, got himself elected to Congress, and then was selected as Secretary of the Treasury. And but he brought a European sensibility here. And he put on parties on the scale of Europeans, not Americans, and this was quite popular. So next to the White House, later under Dolly Madison, this house that he rented for that 12 years was known as the party house in Washington. And so everybody knew the house, and it was famous, and it has been preserved. But we want to go to a particular incident involving the house that came just after Gallatin had left. Here is one of the plats that was done to help sell the lots in the city, and this comes right from our book, Creating Capitol Hill. We've identified the people that we know that bought in this square. And you can see the lower right corner there is Robert Sewell's house in 1800. But I'm going back to that 1801 map to show you why this particular corner is important in that era, and that is, you see the orange arrow there at the top, and that is the road coming into town. It's known now as Bladensburg Road, and it was in fact the road to Bladensburg, Maryland, and that is the road by which the British troops arrived on August the 24th, 1814, with the intent of destroying the city. And you can see the road comes to an intersection there, and that long straight road that goes straight to the Capitol is Maryland Avenue. That's the way things are today still. And so the British troops came in and went on that road toward the Capitol building, which they likely could see from the point at which the road turns there is the edge of the original plan of the city. So everything outside that was still considered countryside. But they turn onto this road, which was not paved, but was straight and clear and was the main road into town. And as they go down the road, if you'll notice, there are no other buildings along the road. And we know that by 1814, there were two buildings at that intersection. And I'll talk about the other one in a moment. But these are the first buildings that the British encountered. Now, what happened at Bladensburg is that the Washington militia had gathered out there to try to stop the British invasion, but they had not been trained. They were just gathering out there as individual citizens. As members of the militia, they had gathered, mustered is the word I was looking for. They had mustered there by the Capitol and then marched out to stop the British. Well, what they had not anticipated was that the British had a new weapon. It was called a Congreve rocket, and the British had gotten it from one of the Maharajas in India, who had adapted Chinese fireworks to try to use them and integrate them in military weaponry. And so what happened was that they were firing what were essentially fireworks with the large projectiles, but the projectiles were not very powerful, and they might hit you and knock you over, but that was about it. But the American troops, because they were not trained, didn't know that, and when these huge projectiles came toward them at the battle, they broke and ran. And they ran all the way back into Washington. Some of them ran up, and they finally gathered themselves together in Rockville, which is way outside Washington. But some of the troops came running down this Maryland Avenue here, and they took refuge in these first two buildings. And then when the British arrived, they proceeded to take shots at the British for doing this. And so the British were unhappy about that. They killed the general's horse out from under him, and they killed some of the British troops. And so some of them were captured, and the British decided to retaliate by burning the houses. And so they burned the Sewell house that you see here and the house across the street, which we'll get to in a little bit. But that's the big important moment on this intersection is August the 24th, 1814. And the two buildings that are there get burned. The Sewell house was rebuilt by 1824. We don't know exactly when. We assume that the foundations were the same. We don't know how much of the building had to be changed. But Sewell filed a claim. The government was paying for the things that the British had done, but with the usual bureaucracy, the building had been burned on August the 24th, 1814. The claim was finally paid in 1856. And by that point, it was claimed by the Congress directly and not by the claims process that the Congress had established. It actually took a bill to finally get Sewell his money. Later on, the building was purchased by the National Women's Party when their headquarters, which was closer to the Capitol than this, was torn down. They purchased this house using money that was donated by Alva Belmont, whose husband was one of the richest people in New York, and she supported women's right to vote and women's rights generally, and so she bought this house so that Alice Paul could live here. Well, so it became known as the Sewell Belmont House after Alva Belmont, since she had paid for it. And Alice Paul lived there. I've even heard, I met someone who had visited the house when Alice Paul lived there, and it was the headquarters of the Women's Party, and she liked to give tours. There are lots of memorabilia in there and so forth, and she liked to give tours, but she would greet you at the door there, and then she would take you into a room where there was a telephone, and she required that you call your congressmen and senators to lobby for the Equal Rights Amendment before she would give you the tour of the house. That was the requirement. The house was finally taken over by the National Park Service just a few years ago. It's now a National Historic Site, but is still the headquarters of the National Women's Party. And it's now called the Belmont Paul National Historic Site after Alva Belmont, who paid for the house, and Alice Paul, who lived there and sort of made it famous, and poor Robert Sewell doesn't get any credit anymore. But of course, as I said, he never lived there anyway, and we don't
Steve,
even know much
hey,
about
Steve,
it.
we got a couple questions from our listeners, and one of them is, we understand that there's a statue of Secretary Gallatin, but it's not at the house. It's over by Treasury. Is that?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, there's a statue of Albert Gallatin by the Treasury Department.
Because of his work there. And then someone also asked, they'd heard a story that when the British were coming in, that they ultimately put the white flag up, and we kept shooting at him even when the white flag was up. Do you know if that's?
That particular story, first of all, I would doubt that the British would have put up a white flag, but the issue was that the Americans would shoot at the British officers, and this was considered improper under European war rules of war. You expected the troops to fire at each other, but you didn't fire at the officers, and the same thing had come up in Boston and in other battles, that the Americans were considered insulting to the British because they actually fired particularly at the officers and purposely killed the general's horse out from under him. This was considered something that a gentleman didn't do. And so this proved to the British that Americans were not worthy.
Oh, okay. We have a couple more questions.
I think it's a more likely story than any red flag. The British still had overwhelming strength and the Americans were still running away. And so I really doubt that any white flag was put up. That doesn't sound right.
Well, and then we have a series of questions about Alice Paul and Mrs. Belmont. Do you know, when did Alva Belmont buy the Sewell house, and how long did Alice Paul live there?
They purchased the house when the buildings were torn down for the Supreme Court. And so that would be in the 1930s. And Alice Paul lived there until she died, I believe, in the 1950s.
Okay. And is the Belmont, is that the same Belmont that has that huge mansion at 13th and Belmont Northwest? Is it that same family?
No, they were from New York. I suppose it's possible. I have not heard that story, but I don't think the Belmonts lived here. He was a Wall Street financier, and so I doubt that.
And this is an easy question. Someone's looking at the picture and they want to know, what is that white building that seems to wrap around the house?
That's what I'm about to talk about.
Perfect. See,
So
we're right on sync.
To the next, the white building is the Hart Senate Office Building, and you can see the left photo shows its relationship along Constitution Avenue to the Sewell Belmont House, and the one on the right is to show you that the Hart Building wraps around the Sewell House. And what happened was the Congress bought that entire block, but the decision was made that they should not tear down this historic property, and instead should wrap around it. And so in fact the property was saved by the fact that it was historic, but then the Congress becomes kind of responsible for it. And since the National Women's Party hasn't been able to pay for its upkeep and so forth, they really can't afford a building like this, particularly with all the problems that a building from 1801 would have. Eventually, the Park Service had to just take it over. And so all the National Park Service maintains it and pays for its maintenance. But the Hart Senate Office building dates in 1983. It's named after Philip Hart, who was a senator from Michigan and well known for being a very kind and gracious gentleman and being quite bipartisan. And so, and he happened to die at the right time when they were wanting to name the building. And so the building got named after him. Half of the senators have their offices in that building. It's a little deceiving in that it looks like it's 4 stories tall, but in fact it's 8. Each of those, what looks like stories here, is 2 stories high. And the reason for that is that the senators' offices are 2 stories high. If you look from the outside, you'll see that some of the windows are divided across the center horizontally, and that's because there are actually 2 rows of offices for staff officers for each senator's office. It takes twice the ceiling height to hold a senator's ego than it does to hold a staff member's ego. And so the building is much more efficient by making the offices actually 2 stories high. The senator's own office is the full 2 stories and then has two layers of staff offices for that. And there's an internal stairway in each of those offices so that they can take advantage of both stories. Now, across the street, across First Street from the Hart Senate Office building is Thompson Marquard Hall. This is owned by a foundation called the Young Women's Christian Home. And it functions like dorms were when I was in college, in that men are never allowed outside the front lounge, even to this day. That's not fashionable in colleges anymore. But at Thompson Marquard Hall, it still is. And the date 1833 is when the organization was founded, and they had various other locations on the hill. But in 1931, they were able to build this building, and it's been there ever since, still following the same rules. Its connection with the Capitol in particular is that when the House and Senate decided to allow women pages, I should say girl pages, because they weren't really women, when they decided to have girl pages, there was no dorms for the pages. The boys just lived around in the neighborhood in apartments and so forth, and they felt this wasn't proper for young girls, and so they rented, and this became some of the rooms here were rented for the women pages of the House and the Senate. We're now across First Street, and this is the plat from that block. The matched pair of lots in the center there are where the Thompson Marquard Hall is, but in the lower corner that's lighter colored is the next building we're going to look at. The lot was purchased and the first building built by Henry Dearborn in 1801. We're not sure that he actually lived there, and we don't know when the house itself was built, but we do know that it was a frame house. And this is the other house that I talked about along Maryland Avenue. It would actually be the first one that the British came upon before they came to the Sewell House across the street there. We know that the house had been rented by Congressman Robert Livingston of Louisiana, but we don't know that he was living there at the time the British got there. We're not really sure who was living there, but this house was frame, was wood, and therefore it burned completely to the ground, whereas the Sewell House was a brick, and so only the interior parts of it of it were burned. So the house on the corner here was rebuilt. We don't know when, but it had to be completely rebuilt. This is a photograph of it. You can see the orange arrow is pointing to the later house. This is 1863, so this is probably the house that was built after the fire. In the center is General Dearborn, and as you can see, General Dearborn ought to get credit for having invented the mullet hairdo. He was military in the front and party in the back. But it's important to know who he was, because he was the general who led the militia that went to Detroit and then invaded Canada from there earlier. And it was that raid where they went in and offered the Canadians to be free of British tyranny, and the Canadians refused for reasons we still don't quite understand. And in retaliation, the troops burned the capital of Upper Canada, which was then in York, which is now part of Toronto. So he was the one that was in charge when the provocation happened that the British used as an excuse for coming here and burning our capital. We had already burned the capital of Upper Canada, the British Canada, and so the British troops came here and claimed that they were retaliating for having burned their capital. And they burned the house that General Dearborn owned here in Washington. But they didn't know he owned it. They burned it because the troops had used it as a shelter. But they were, in fact, specifically retaliating against him without even knowing it. Now, this is the building that sits on that corner now. It's the VFW building, built in the 1950s. Kind of a very ordinary plain marble box, but it looks fancy, and now it has a wonderful memorial in the corner there. You can see the bronze flames coming out of the top of it there. And it happens that next to the top floor there of the VFW building today is the offices of the United States Capitol Historical Society. That's where we all work, is in that building. On the site that was burned by the British in 1814. It happens that we got that space from the Warren Commission. That is where the offices were for Chief Justice Warren and the other people on the commission that were investigating the assassination of President Kennedy. In the office that we have now is where in the conference room, Marina Oswald was interviewed by the commission, and a lot of their activities took place there. And recently, they've been doing a lot of retrospectives of films, videos, and so forth about the history of the Warren Commission. And some of them have been taped in our library because it was the conference room of the Warren Commission there. And we've had those offices ever since. In fact, Senator Arlen Specter at one point was on that commission staff, and he came over to see his office one day while he was still a senator. He has since died. So that is our office, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
Steve, while you take a breath for a minute, I want you to know that we heard from our listeners that they were laughing at the mullet joke. And since you couldn't hear them because they're all muted, they wanted to make sure that you knew that they appreciated that.
Thank you.
And now we have a couple of more questions. And Francis Folsom had asked about the Sewell Belmont House. Is that the house where Secretary Sewell was beaten? Was Secretary Sewell, do you know that story?
Okay, Sewell was never a secretary. Okay. He was a landowner out in Prince George's County. His property was amusingly, is now, as I understand it, called His Lordship's Kindness, indicating that there was some loyalty involved there. But what I've read lately says that was not the name of the establishment at the time of the Revolution. So I'm not sure what his position was in the Revolution, but Sewell was never secretary. The secretary was Gallatin.
Okay.
Secretary of the Treasury. And there are some other prominent officials who have lived in that building.
And then Karen Schmidt asked about the fireworks rockets that you referred to, and whether those fireworks rockets were the same rockets that people thought of with the rocket's red glare of the anthem.
Yes, in fact, that is the origin of that term, rocket's red glare. Rockets had not been used in combat before, and so it was very unusual, and that was something that everybody noted, particularly Francis Scott Key, and so the rocket's red glare does in fact come from the Congreve rockets.
And then we have a few Livingston fans, noting that Robert Livingston Jr. was a former House member, almost the Speaker of the House. Is he related to the
Yes.
R.R. Livingston? And what's the story about that?
Well, the Livingstons were in New York, but then they discovered there was a lot of money to be made in Louisiana, and so New Orleans was the second largest city in the United States and the second largest port, and so the Livingstons moved down there, and it's the same family that's been around since colonial times, but in both locations. Robert Livingston, the congressman from Louisiana, not the one that's still alive, but the one from the beginning of the 19th century, was married to someone from the Carroll family as well.
Interesting. Okay, well, take us continue on the tour. This is
Okay. Now this is another moment in the history of this neighborhood. This is Constitution Avenue going both directions, and the one on the left is looking. You can see the Capitol on the far left, and then looking down, and you get a sense that you come to the edge of a hill and then drop off, and then you can see in the far distance is Constitution Avenue. This is the route of a parade. In 1925, one of the great parades in Washington history was the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan marched from the White House down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol to mark this as their territory. And then at the end of the parade, many of them had gathered in other places, and many of them came walking up Constitution Avenue here. And the slide on the right shows the continuation of Constitution. It's a very narrow street after this point. It's not the big wide avenue, but it's still called Constitution. At that time, it was called B Street, and along that street is where the Kelly family lived. Tom Kelly was a well-known writer. His wife, Marguerite Kelly, had something called the Mother's Almanac that became famous, and she was still publishing that in the Washington Post as I was being a father. And then their son was Michael Kelly, who was killed. I believe he was editor of the Atlantic or one of the other. It escapes me now which publication. At any rate, he was quite prominently killed. The story that comes from Tom Kelly's memoirs, he gave a lecture for the U.S. Capitol Historical Society from his memoirs, and he talked about the Klan parade, which took place while his family was living there. Well, the Klan at that time was very heavily anti-Catholic. And of course, the Kellys were Catholics. And so here were these people coming by his house on a really hot summer day and had just been out demonstrating against his family. But his mother, his Irish mother, could not stand the fact that people were walking by her house and very, very thirsty. And so she went out and served water to the marchers that had been there protesting his family. That's typical of Irish hospitality. But that's another great moment, I should say a notorious moment in this same intersection. Now we're going to talk about another house. This is the Mountjoy Bailey house. It wasn't built until after the British burned the neighborhood, but in the rebuilding of the neighborhood, Mountjoy Bailey was a clerk in the House of Representatives, and he decided to build a house for speculation as well. He did not live in it either. on the right, you can see the same photograph from 1863 taken from the Capitol Dome. You can see the Sewell House in the background, or in the center there, but in front of it, you see the sort of blunt end of the Mountjoy Bailey House, and this is as it appears on the left here. So that house dates to 1817. You can see, like the Sewell House, that it has been enlarged, but is still there. And these are the only two really old historic buildings left in the neighborhood. This is the side of the house. You can see that wall that you saw on the previous, and the house is now known as the Stuart Mott House. In that apartment up in the top, in the gable end, or in the mansard roof, was an apartment for Stuart Mott, the millionaire. He was dabbled in politics and used his money back before there was much control, I should say, over contributions to campaigns. And so in that apartment in the top are where the campaigns for Eugene McCarthy in 1968 and George McGovern in 1972, two campaigns that he was one of the major contributors to, were conceived and planned in that apartment at the top. It's now owned by or I should say it's used primarily by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. And because it was a historic house, we thought that would be an appropriate place to hold the launch of our book. But we discovered that because the house is limited to uses by the Democratic Party, we wouldn't be able to invite any Republicans to the launch of the book, and so that was not an appropriate place to launch our book because of that restriction. Now, on the third corner is this blue castellated building here. That was a historic drugstore and soda fountain. I've seen a historic photograph of it, but I wasn't able to find it for this presentation. But the building is now owned by the American Center for Law and Justice, which is a conservative answer to the American Civil Liberties Union. And it's there because it's right by the Supreme Court. On the other side is Justice Court. This is on Maryland Avenue that you're looking at here, sort of right where it separates from Constitution. Originally, this is a recent development from the 1980s, and originally it was planned with a square in the center. It would be common area, and all of the townhouses would be arranged around that square with their rear ends out here on the historic avenues. And so the only recognition of the historic avenue was going to be people's leaving their trash out there. And so the people in the neighborhood, including me, got together and protested this plan, and we were able to get them to change it so that the townhouses face out and there's a parking lot in the center. But there are a number of congressmen and senators and former members that live there in that development now on the block. The fourth corner is occupied by the Supreme Court itself, and this is seeing it from that end. You usually see the Supreme Court from the Capitol, which is off to the right here. But this is what it looks like from this intersection. And there's one cute little piece of trivia here. This is the view from the Capitol along Maryland Avenue, and off to the right is the Supreme Court here. And you can see at the end the avenue jogs to the left. And that is recent. They refurbished the Supreme Court and they added a section to the Supreme Court grounds by moving the avenue slightly off to the left and making an intersection there. But that is a change to L'Enfant's plan, and so in honor of that, they did this. You can see this, there are two of these plaques which are down along the ground here. They're bronze, and they're sort of in the middle of the curb that's holding that has the sidewalk on one side and the Supreme Court grounds on the other. But they have marked the line where Maryland Avenue originally was. That's where L'Enfant wanted the avenue to be. And they have put these little plaques there to commemorate that. And I think that's a commendable way of paying respect to the history of the area without interfering with the functionality of it. Here are a couple of other things, locations within a half a block there. The National Center for State Courts, which is a conservative lobbying group and educational function for state courts, and they have along 2nd Street there. They have this townhouse. But if you can see the one next door, the sort of cream-colored townhouse. There's an odd-looking sort of tablet up in it, and this is what it looks like. Sorry. There you go. It is actually a copy of the 10 Commandments, or a reciting of the 10 Commandments in the corner there. For a while, this house had a huge banner in front protesting Supreme Court decisions, but the neighbors got together because the banner was in violation of the zoning laws. And so after working things out, they came up with this set of 10 commandments that they can put in the yard there without violating the zoning. And so this is another group that's protesting the decisions of the Supreme Court. And so that's it. That's the neighborhood at 2nd and Constitution. And so we now have a little time for some questions. Jane?
Absolutely. Well, you got to love our audience because they're in a little conversation, Steve, while you're doing your story. And they've determined that they think this whole conversation about Secretary Seward was not Secretary Sewell, but Secretary William Seward, who was being beaten about the time of the Lincoln assassination. And that is sort of what people were thinking about when they were talking about that.
Seward's house was up on F Street by the or maybe E Street, near the White House. He did not live on Capitol Hill.
So we got that sorted out. And then somebody asked a question from the very beginning: how come Garfield got a statue, but McKinley didn't get a statue in Washington, D.C.? Do you know anything about that?
Garfield's assassination was considered a real tragedy because everybody was really looking forward to having James Garfield as president. He was highly respected and so forth, and so there was an outpouring of grief over Garfield's death, and it happened that a lot of Washington was sort of being cleaned up and reorganized at that point. That's not true at the time that McKinley was assassinated, and McKinley was quickly eclipsed by Theodore Roosevelt anyway, and so my perception is that the reason why there was not the outpouring of grief or the great disappointment over McKinley that there had been over Garfield. You might remember that McKinley had beaten William Jennings Bryan, the great populist crusader, and so he was considered quite conservative, whereas Garfield was going to clean up after the Grant administration, and so his assassination was considered much more of a national tragedy. And Garfield's was only the second assassination. We weren't used to it the way we became later.
Right, and he also was from Ohio, mother of presidents.
Both of them were from.
Right, do a cheer for my hometown state. One of our conversations with our audience is that Anna St. John wanted you to point out that Michael Kelly was the editor of The Atlantic and was the first embedded journalist to die covering the Iraq War in 2003, and that the Kelly family has lived since the 1960s at 5th and Constitution right there. So part of the more, Capitol Hill stories as we talk about the incredible neighborhood.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna, for that. I had a senior moment, couldn't remember what Michael Kelly was the editor of. I would add that Tom Kelly lives on the same block where he was born. And there on the 5th and Constitution. He was born in another house on that block, and he eventually bought the fancy house at 5th and Constitution. But the Kelly family is well known, and I know that you, Anna, are a local as well, and so are acquainted with them. He had actually gone to St. Joseph's School at St. Joseph's Church, which is a block further up from the one I've been talking about.
And couple questions is this John Kelly related to John Kelly of the Washington Post? Is that the Kelly related to that Kelly family?
This is Tom
Kelly.
Kelly.
Is he related to John Kelly?
I do not know that there's any relationship with John Kelly.
And then here's a trivia question. Is it true that there's a tennis court on the roof of the Dirksen building?
I'm not sure it's tennis. There are athletic facilities up there. Rumor has it that there's a place where before there were so many women senators, that the senators didn't bother with bathing suits when they were sunbathing. But there are handball courts. There were to be handball courts on the 9th floor of the Hart Building, and I believe there is some kind of a ball court, whether it's tennis or paddleball, I'm not sure, on the roof of the Dirksen. Yes, there is a gym in the building. I'm not even sure where it is, but there are various facilities that.
I know where the gym is. The gym is right there in the Dirksen, and it is true that the swimming pool used to be, the men were not required to wear bathing suits, and this created a little bit of problem when Barbara Mikulski was elected to the Senate. Not that she was really anxious to swim, but just the principle was upsetting to her, and so ultimately they did require bathing suits to be worn. So, progress comes slowly. Also, Tom Clauda tells us about the tennis court. The tennis court, there used to be a tennis court, but it was torn down. And you can see a picture of the tennis courts in a photo that's in the Capitol. So when the Capitol opens again, we can go find that picture. So that, and one of the other questions, which was more, you showed so many of the townhouses that are now institutional, was that, when did that become common? That the homes would be turned into institutional use?
As a former member of the Capitol Hill Restoration Society, I know that the Restoration Society has been fighting that particular issue, certainly since the 1950s. But the buildings were of mixed use to begin with. And I know that some of Thomas Law's houses that were intended to be boarding houses, in fact, became the headquarters of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. And so the functionality of those buildings as to whether they were houses or businesses goes back pretty much to the beginning.
And one more question, going back to the Sewell Belmont House. It was burned in 1824, but you said it was the 1830s when Alice Paul moved in. So it would have been around about that time that it was rebuilt?
No, it was burned in 1814.
Okay.
And Alice Paul was there until the 1950s.
Okay. And she moved in
the 1930s.
In the 1930s. Okay. So we're not 100% sure when it got rebuilt after it was burned in 1814.
Right, because particularly, well, let's see, we know that it was on the tax rolls by 1824. And so it was rebuilt somewhat time between 1815 and 1824.
During that 10-year period. It
might have been delayed by the fact that the Claims Commission did not pay off Sewell. That story I didn't want to get into, but the fact is that they had to have an investigation as to whether the use of the property was ordered by an officer or an enlisted man. And if it was ordered by an enlisted man, then the government doesn't have responsibility for it. It was not a government installation. But so they had to fight about that, and they had to take statements from people who told you to hide in the house there. and all of this went through. And finally, the Congress just stepped in and said, we owe the family this money. Probably Sewell was dead by that point, 1856, but they finally got their payoff by 1856 by passing a special bill through the Congress and not through the bureaucracy.
Well, Steve, just talking to you, it's something we could do hour after hour. And so we will reconvene next week with a new intersection. Next week we'll be at the corner of Delaware and A, not a corner that exists anymore, with a story about what's happened there. And somebody was asking, how do you spell the Rockets? And the answer I'm getting is Congreve, Congreve.
That is correct.
And so anyone who wants to look up some more about the Rockets Red Glare and the Congreve Rockets, that is absolutely available. Don't forget that we have tomorrow the Capitol Visitors Center video being premiered in this very space. Next week we'll be back for a scholar series with Felicia Bell and then Steve again. So we really appreciate all of you who are our audience and our supporters. The Capitol Historical Society is really important at this time when we know that everyone is locked down, but looking for how are we going to work our democracy in this challenging time. And we can always learn from how our democracy has thrived in challenging times and will continue to grow. And so all of you who are supporters and members, thank you very much. Those of you who've not yet become, what a golden opportunity. Several people are asking about the links to the videos. Those links to the videos will be available on the website, the USCS website. Thank you so very much. And the chat feature will be open for a minute if you want to add in your questions, and we will incorporate the questions into next week. And we want to make sure that you also know that the book itself is available through the USCS Capitol website. Just press shop and you can find the book. Thank you very much. Lauren, thank you much. Is there any technical sign off that we need?
I'll just note, just in case people go to the website looking for videos, the video from today's talk will be emailed. There'll be a link emailed to all registrants in the next day or two, and that'll be available for a limited time. Eventually, we'll get everything up on our website. We're not quite there yet. We're actively working on it, so if you'll be patient, we will get our archives going eventually. But in the short term, you have access for a week or two to each of the talks. So if you've registered, you'll receive a link in your email.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you next week or see you tomorrow.